Relating learning material to students' lives is a powerful way to help students remember what they are learning. Asking students to think of examples of the learning material from their daily lives, or how they might apply the learning material to their professional goals, even asking students to consider their beliefs around the material, or to choose their favorite topic as the basis of the class project, all will help students better remember the learning material. Relating to students' lives is actually a form of elaboration. I have a separate video on elaborate as a teaching tip. As I mentioned in that video, elaboration, or to elaborate, is to incorporate detail into what is being learned by helping students to make connections between what is being learned and what is already known. For example, in that video, I elaborate on how this cat got its name, and despite it being quite an unusual name, the elaboration makes it much easier to remember. When students make connections between new content, new information, and knowledge that they already have, the content is better understood and the resulting memory more durable. The thing is, it really isn't possible to learn something new without relating it to what is already known, at least to some degree. Learners make sense of new things they encounter, they interpret them and give them meaning based on what they already know. For that reason, existing knowledge is like glue for new learning. The more students relate new learning to what they already know, their existing frameworks of knowledge, the more durable the new learning will be. It will stick around in memory for longer, and it will be more deeply understood. Okay, back to the active teaching tip, relate to students' lives. Relate to students' lives is a form of elaboration, a more potent form, where new learning is connected to students' knowledge about themselves and their lives in particular. If we consider students' general background knowledge as being like glue, because it helps the new learning to stick, then background knowledge specifically about themselves is the superglue of elaboration. Of all the things that students have in their networks of existing knowledge, what they already know, the richest, most elaborate information is of themselves. Let me briefly touch on a study that highlights this extra stickiness of information pertaining to the self. A study conducted by Serban and colleagues showed participants a number of pictures of objects and later tested their memory for those objects. As they showed each object to a participant, they would ask the participant to make a judgment about the object. For some of the objects, they asked if the participant thought that it was an object that former U.S. President Bill Clinton would buy sometime in the next year. For other objects, they asked if the participant thought that you, meaning the participant, would buy it in the next year. 2 days later, participants were asked to return to the lab for a memory test. Some items were ones the participants had seen those 2 days earlier, and others were new. Participants were asked to judge whether each object was a new one or an old one that they remembered seeing previously. However, the experimenters weren't actually interested in the new versus old judgments. What the experimenters were really interested in was those objects, or participants' memories for those objects anyway, that they had seen before. The experimenters had asked participants to think differently about those two categories of objects, to relate to them differently, to see if that would affect how well the participants later remembered the objects. And as suspected, participants were better at remembering objects they had related to themselves than the objects that they had thought about in terms of Bill Clinton. The idea is that participants have much richer, more elaborate, and dense networks of knowledge about themselves than they do about someone like Bill Clinton. And this allows them to better associate and integrate the objects in question into memory. This observation across research studies of better memory for information when it relates to the self or has been associated with the self is referred to as the self-reference effect. So, how can we incorporate the self-reference effect into the classroom? How can we relate material to students' lives? This is just a specific form of elaborative encoding, so instructors would approach it in the same way as they would the elaborate tip, just with a specific focus on students' selves. But let's take a look at a few ideas that are specific to relating material to students' selves. One way to specifically target students' knowledge about themselves is when sharing examples to make them personal to students. So, for example, if an instructor has to lecture about nutrition, perhaps they can incorporate examples that involve what the students had for breakfast. Instead of talking about the respiratory system, instructors can talk about your respiratory system, your meaning the students. Instructors might also place examples in a setting likely to be familiar to students, such as the campus food court. This is an easy thing to do in psychology courses, the courses I teach, since the content is always about human life and what's going on in the brain, and all students have a human brain and its associated experiences. Also, instructors can pose questions that encourage students to think about how the material relates to their own lives. I could do this with all of you now, those of you who are teachers anyway, by asking you to think about how you could apply this technique to your next upcoming lesson. Also, if an instructor invites students to consider their opinions and beliefs during the learning process, that also makes use of this self-reference effect. And this last one lends itself really well to class projects and assignments, but it may also be applicable during a lesson. If there are opportunities for students to have a choice over the topic of focus, perhaps for an in-class activity or discussion topic, maybe even the selection of a case study for an activity, or if there's an in-class activity where students have to bring in an example of something, all of those things can invoke this self-reference effect because often students will select a topic or make a choice that has some relevance to their lives. And to bring things to a close and to get you to reflect back on and review what we just went over, I'd love for you to think about how you can answer this question. How might you incorporate self-reference in your class? What ideas do you have? Pause the video as long as you need to do this brief reflection.